Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere. I'm the founder of Supply Chain Insights, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the second in the series of What Would I Tell My 25-Year-Old Self? This series will be interviews of 25 supply chain professionals as they look back and they think, what would I have told my 25-year-old self? And hopefully that will give you great insights for managing your career. Today, I'm interviewing Peter Bolstorff. Now, Peter and I have known each other for at least 30 years, Peter?
At least.
Yeah. Tell the group a little bit about yourself.
Sure. And again, I'm going to give it a little broader perspective. I am looking back a long time to get back to my 25-year-old self. I am a mathematics, education, and psychology undergrad. My grad degree was in industrial education, really focusing on human resource development, performance management, and that kind of stuff. Had nothing to do with supply chain. And so, again, my lessons learned in supply chain came through the School of Hard Knocks through manufacturing. And so when you think about milestone companies, 3M was kind of where I learned the guts of what good manufacturing looks like and what good HR practices look like. So again, for the audience, I had the cheat sheet questions from Lora yesterday, and I told her this morning in our prep that I have been pondering this, what would I tell my 25-year-old self, for a while, and I'm not sure I'm any closer to right, but I certainly have some perspectives.
You know, Peter, interestingly, I did a workshop on Monday with someone who actually roomed with you when you were at 3M. And, you know, he was talking about your 25-year-old self. So I thought, oh, that'll be interesting. You know,
This will be, well, now I have to tell the truth.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. You know, interestingly, 25 years, my 25-year-old self seems like yesterday, but, at 70, a lot of time has passed. And, let's talk to Peter and his 25-year-old self. What
Sure.
would you have told Peter?
So I think the big thing, as I look back, I've had over 15 different roles, and again, when I started with 3M, I thought, oh, I finally got it, right? I'm in for life. And that lasted 4 years, and then the spinoff happened within Amation. And so what I learned, what would I tell my 25-year-old self is really, really focus on content and something that will make you employable, right? And so so I'm thinking I love psychology because I love people and I love to understand kind of how people tick and all those kind of things. But mathematics is really what got me the job. Did I love mathematics with a passion? No. Did it get me an engineering type role in supply chain? Absolutely. And so I think there's always a balance on, what do you love and what will make you employable? Not in a job necessarily, but in a career. What are those things that are kind of hot? And then, and what's not, so anyway, so that would be the first thing I would tell my 25-year-old self is continue to think about learning in terms of what do you love, and then what's going to keep you on top of content that will be employable.
Make you attractive to an employer.
Yeah.
When I went to the University of Tennessee, I was in chemical engineering and I absolutely hated it. And,
but employable.
I had to take systems theory twice, the first time, I got a C, and, I was an honor student and I wasn't going to have a C on my record. So I had to take it twice. That's probably the best class I've ever taken for supply chain, right? It really helped me to think differently, even though I hated it, right? And I would take 30 hours a quarter, about 15 of those hours were things that Lora loved, like writing and philosophy. Right. And 15 of those hours were, Laplace theorem, and, systems theory and dynamics and, PChem, things that, I wasn't so fond of. But I think that diversity helped my mental
Yeah,
state, but made me more employable. And so
yeah,
thinking about how you're employable, not only for short term, but long term, right?
yeah, yeah. One thing, Laura, that just came up now that I did not know about you, as long as we've known each other, is I did my master's thesis in industrial education on chaos theory and systems thinking and its application to business. And that's where I connected the dots between supply chain and what you despised most in your employability curriculum.
Well, the whole concept of systems theory is
Oh,
actually the foundation of the supply chains to admire. And,
absolutely.
the great work Regina's done on the orbit charts, right?
Yeah. Well, and just a plug, shameless plug, by the way, supply chains to admire and the orbit charts to me are the only true research-driven supply chain benchmark at the shareholder level. So I use them all the time. Just shameless
Well, thank you.
plug. Well done,
Where
Regina.
we're currently getting ready to republish that, and we look forward to it. And, we're a little late because we've been working with Georgia Tech trying to, change the methodology, and that's a whole story for another podcast. But anyway,
Yes.
getting back to our 25-year-old self, right?
Yeah.
As you think back, right? My first job was with Procter and Gamble. Your first job was with 3M. I thought I would work with Procter and Gamble a lifetime, right? I worked with
Mhm.
Procter and Gamble for 3 years due to family differences. And my ex-husband decided he hated Cincinnati and the operable ward there's X. But, as we think about transitions in life and preparing ourselves for transitions, right? I never thought I'd be fired, right? I've been fired twice. I was embarrassed to tell people that I was fired, but picking yourself up and moving on and the transitions of life, I think is something that you gotta just do, right? It's like life happens. So what would be your advice to your 25-year-old self to prepare for those life transitions?
Great question. So I think everybody has to have in their mind that there are going to be times when you choose, and there are going to be some times when you don't choose. And I think the biggest thing for me is your state of mind. You cannot hold resentments. You can't let the transitions own you. You need to, grieve. Again, grieving, you need to grieve. That's a natural, psychological process. But don't let the transition own your future. You need to continue to own it yourself. And I think, when you look out the backside and you look at the steps that you've made, almost for those folks that embrace the change and really focus on employability, learning and networking and all those kind of things, you can see the footprints of where they go. And, again, as I look back at 62 and I look back at my path, it was the absolute right path as I look backwards. You don't see it though when you're actually trudging the career path. And so again, you can't take it personally. Don't let the transition own your future. And grieve, but grieve quickly. And that's kind of how I look at it.
Well, as we think about those career transitions, I think one of the things that was important to me is a network of good friends, right?
Oh,
That I could talk to, right? And I've been very fortunate to cultivate what I consider to be, good friendships, right? That, allow me to talk over those hard times. And
yeah.
they call me, when they have hard times, right? And so I think don't underestimate the power of the network and, the ability for you to be human in that network, right? As you go through those transitions. Your thoughts?
I do. I have some strong thoughts on this one. So I want to peel apart, and this is my psychological self coming out, right? I want to peel apart what do we mean by network? So there's a circle of what I'm going to call friends and colleagues that know me They know how I lead. They know how I operate. They know me as a person. They know my family. They know me. And that number does not need to be an influencer list. That number does not need to be represented in my followers. That number does not need to be represented anywhere on social media. These are peeps that, if I text them, they're going to text me back in 5 minutes. I think that crowd does not need to be a big number, but that crowd is essential, as you said, Laura, to what I would call just coping, not with supply chain necessarily, but just coping with life, right? So that's one. And I think the second one is, we're all learning, as social media. Again, I watched my kids go through this when AOL was first introduced, Instagram was first introduced, Facebook came online, and I watched their stress level go from here to here. And, and I'm thinking, gosh, how do I sort through all that? How can I help as a father? There's a great book called Disconnected, and it's sad but true, but and I was reading through it the other day. It really helps clarify to me LinkedIn. And I think when you think about LinkedIn, there's lots of good things about LinkedIn for sure. But I think when you put too much faith in the fact that I got this many likes and I got this many comments and I got this many followers and I have this many connections, it becomes an unreal gauge of self-esteem, that can get you up in the morning and looking at social media and just start your day off in the hole. And so again, that's where you have to go back to, who are my true friends? What am I using LinkedIn for? What am I learning from it? So I have a lot there, and I'll stop because I could go on and on.
And the interesting thing to me about LinkedIn, and I never imagined I'd have over 300,000 followers, right? And
Exactly.
but I think giving back is a really important concept. And
Absolutely.
And I think part of our legacy is about giving back, right? And, to me, those that are takers on LinkedIn, right, or any other place, right, have short presence, right? But giving back, and, it does make me feel good when I go to a session or a conference and somebody says, I've been reading your stuff. And I'll say, how long have you been reading my stuff? And they'll say about 10 years. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
What an honor it is to serve the community for that period of time.
And I'm going to be one of those people that I've been reading your stuff for over 10 years. So I'm in that camp.
Yeah. So, making it through life transitions, a great network, making yourself employable. The other thing that I've learned is you can't imagine your career of the future, right? I never thought I'd be a blogger. There wasn't such a thing as a blogger. There wasn't such a thing as LinkedIn. Wasn't such thing as an industry analyst when I was in college. And I went to Temple, and one of my professors said, you'll have 13 different job opportunities that you couldn't even imagine, right? And if I think about, the evolution of technology and, whether it's robot supervisors or AI foundries or AI ontological framework builders, right? Those are all kind of emerging technologies that require diversity of thought. And, how do you think people prepare for that?
I think so good question, Laura. So my strategy over time has been to hang on and become expert at some core thing that's not going to change a lot, right? Some foundational thing. And I'm going to, again, and so let's think about the SCORE model for just a second, right?
Right.
So you can argue that it's not quite up to date and it's not quite comprehensive and it's not quite this and it's not quite that.
We've had
But
some of those discussions.
we have. And I would agree with all of that. However, when you think about, and again, I first introduced to SCORE back in 1995, I think. And I've met tons of people through that whole process, through the trade association and through ASCM. And I've used the model to help advance the profession. And it's given me a way of having a foundation, a solid foundation that I can launch from, and I can inquire, and I can layer on new technologies, and I can do this and I can do that. It gives me a place, kind of a framework and an ideological web to be able to embrace all this chaos coming in and be able to bucketize it. If I didn't have some base and I was just literally just thinking points of light coming at me on new tech and all this kind of thing, it'd drive me nuts. I'd be nuts. So that's one big one, right? The second one is you got to keep track of trends, not as a follower, but as a learner, right? And really dig down in terms of where can I find good content about a trend that I can trust, right? And you have been one of those, I'll call it foundational, so if some new trend comes out, I'm going to say, well, I wonder what Lora thinks about this, right? That's one of my top 3 thoughts is I wonder what Lora thinks about this. You're going to have to learn how to vet new ideas in terms of, are they real or are they not? Because again, you all know, you know better than most the bandwagon effect that you can get on new tech stuff, right? Again, as a reminder, people are only using 30% or so of what they bought 5 years ago from a tech standpoint. Whether they need it or not, different question. But I'm just saying the fact is return on invested capital and revenue growth, 2 of the supply chains to admire metric pairs, aren't good, right? People have not been using the tech that they purchased well, period. And now we're heading into this new hype cycle with AI. Can you imagine, stacking on top of that? Because again, our data is not that much cleaner than it was 15, 20 years ago. I mean, people still think they're cleaning master data, right? All they call it a digital twin now, I think. So just to make it sexier.
Well, let's get back to some of your
Sorry.
thoughts, right? So I think getting clear about your mental model and understanding your mental model. That's why one of the things I have people do in class is draw a supply chain. It helps me to understand their mental model. Some people are very focused on linear thinking, the outside in, and some of the work you've done on SCORE when I was on the SCORE Council, helped me to form my mental model. But I think identify what your mental model is.
Yes.
And evolve your mental model over time, but be clear on that. And then secondly, I think, as we have all these tech trends, right? I was talking to people the other day about flow casting and CPFR and VMI and,
I love that.
Efficient
consumer response, ECR.
Efficient consumer. We have all these kind of trends that sweep the market, and they're going to be the best thing since sliced bread. I remember when I was at Clorox and I first started with Walmart Retail Link and the introduction of VMI, I'm like, wow, we're going to be outside in using consumer data. And today, nobody really uses consumer data in their supply chain. So I think we have to learn, be natural skeptics and, really observe. I think, as we go through life, we've got to have big eyes, big ears, and little mouths, right? It's like managing ourselves through that is, I think, a challenge, right?
I go back to the best class I took in my psychology degree was a counseling psychology class, and we spent 80% of our time learning how to be an effective listener. And it's a skill and a talent. Yes. But it is a skill. It can be learned.
Yeah. So, Peter, for that young college grad, what are the top 3 pieces of advice you would give them?
Get involved with a professional network somehow. So as you transition from college to professional life, get involved somehow with a professional network. Again, you've got ASCM, you got ISM, you got CSCMP, you've got AME. Get involved somewhere with a professional network that gets you outside and gets you developing your, that whole genre, number one. Number two, also understand that there are other paths than 4-year degrees and advanced degrees to knowledge acquisition. You've got certifications, you've got, tons of free classes now that you're seeing. So again, explore the options in terms of how do you keep yourself current. And then the third thing is, don't forget to develop your high touch. We've got the high tech piece, but how do you develop high touch? How do I become a good team player? What are the traits of an effective leader? And how do I continue to develop those skills? How do I learn how to tell a story, with writing and those kinds of things? How do I be a good friend? These, and again, you hear them soft skills, and I don't like that word much because they're actually more important these days than what you know on the tech side. So don't ignore or let atrophy those skills that ultimately are going to make you a better person and a better leader, because the tech stuff is just going to happen.
Well, thanks for, first of all, being in my network, and you've been a good friend. And second of all, thanks for joining the show today.
Loved it. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Lora Cecere. This is Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. This is part of the series of What Would I Tell My 25-Year-Old Self? And it's a great honor to be able to talk to Peter Bolstorff. I first met Peter when I was on the SCORE Council, and when I was an analyst at AMR Research, and Peter transitioned to ASCM and now runs his own company. But it's been great to talk to you today. Thanks, Peter.
Wonderful. Peace.